Little Omega whispered, "Can I sleep by your gate?" But the Alpha King said, "No, you belong beside me inside." For the first time in his life, the ruthless king who had sworn never to love found himself captivated at first sight by a trembling stranger in the snow. But who is this mysterious Omega whose mere presence could melt the heart of the North's most feared ruler? And what dark fate awaits her in a kingdom crawling with enemies who will do anything to destroy a love that threatens their power? Chapter 1. The Crown's Cold Weight. King Dominic stood alone on the battlements of Shadowmere Fortress, his dark cloak whipping in the bitter wind that howled across the northern peaks. At 30, he commanded respect through strength rather than affection, his steel-gray eyes reflecting the same coldness as the stone walls surrounding him. The night sky stretched endlessly above, stars hidden behind thick winter clouds that promised another harsh storm. His advisors had departed an hour ago, leaving behind scrolls bearing portraits of potential Lunas, noble Alpha's daughters whose bloodlines would strengthen political alliances. Each face blurred together in his mind, beautiful but meaningless, representing duty without desire. Marriage had always been a transaction in his world, love a luxury kings could not afford. Dominic's fingers traced the ancient scar along his jaw, a reminder of the night he learned that emotion led to weakness. His father had chosen love over strategy once, bringing his mother into a war that ultimately claimed her life. The lesson had carved itself into Dominic's soul. A king who loved was a king who failed his people. The fortress stretched beneath him like a sleeping giant, its corridors empty of laughter, its halls echoing only with the footsteps of servants and soldiers. He had built this isolation deliberately, surrounding himself with duty and distance, believing strength lay in solitude. Yet tonight, beneath the cloud-heavy sky, restlessness stirred in his chest like a caged wolf. Something felt different about this particular evening, though he couldn't name what. The very air seemed charged with possibility, as if the approaching storm carried whispers of change. A guard's shout from the courtyard below broke through his contemplation. "Movement at the main gate, Your Majesty. Someone approaches through the storm." Dominic straightened, his hand instinctively moving to his sword hilt. Visitors during winter storms were rare, and those who traveled such treacherous paths usually brought either desperate news or deadly intent. The practical part of his mind calculated threats, while something deeper stirred with inexplicable anticipation. He descended the stone steps with measured grace, each footfall echoing his certainty that whatever waited beyond those gates would test the walls he had built around his heart. Chapter 2. The Scent of Destiny. The courtyard buzzed with tension as Dominic emerged from the keep, his breath forming silver clouds in the frigid air. Guards stood in a protective semicircle around the main gate, their torches casting dancing shadows across the snow. Beyond the iron bars, a figure huddled against the stone archway, barely visible through the swirling snowflakes. "What is the nature of this disturbance?" Dominic demanded, his voice carrying the authority that had commanded armies. Captain Marcus stepped forward, his weathered face grim with concern. "A lone traveler, Your Majesty. Appears to be an Omega, though they refuse to state their business or origin." Dominic moved closer to the gate, and the wind shifted. Suddenly, a scent unlike anything he had ever encountered struck him with the force of a physical blow. It was warmth in the midst of winter, honey and wildflowers mixed with something uniquely, impossibly perfect. His wolf stirred within him for the first time in years, recognition blazing through his consciousness like lightning. The mate bond. He had heard of it in whispered legends, stories of predestined connections that bound souls across lifetimes. Yet he had never believed such tales, dismissing them as romantic fantasies that had no place in a king's reality. The figure beyond the gate shifted, and moonlight caught the silver gleam of long hair beneath a tattered hood. Something deep in Dominic's chest clenched with unexpected protectiveness, an urge so powerful it nearly brought him to his knees. "Open the gate," he commanded, his voice rougher than intended. His guards exchanged uncertain glances. Your Majesty, protocol demands we question unknown visitors before. I said, open it. The words emerged as a low growl that brooked no argument. As the heavy iron gate swung inward with a rusty groan, Dominic found himself stepping forward, rather than maintaining the safe distance his training demanded. The scent grew stronger, wrapping around him like a promise he never knew he needed. The figure remained hunched against the cold, face hidden beneath the hood, but Dominic could see the trembling that shook their slight frame. Every instinct screamed at him to provide shelter, protection, and warmth. For the first time in his adult life, duty warred with something far more primitive and urgent. His carefully constructed world had just shifted on its axis, and he wasn't certain he would ever find his footing again. Chapter 3. The Whispered Request. The stranger slowly raised their head, and Dominic's breath caught in his throat. Beneath the hood was the most beautiful face he had ever seen, delicate features framed by silver-white hair that caught the moonlight like spun starlight. But it was her eyes that undid him completely, deep violet depths that held exhaustion, fear, and a fragile hope that made his chest ache. She was an Omega, unmistakably so, her scent confirming what her slight build suggested. Yet there was a strength in the way she held herself, a dignity that even obvious hunger and cold couldn't diminish. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her lips were blue with cold, but she met his gaze without flinching. "Your Majesty," she whispered, her voice like music despite its weakness. I don't ask for much. Just—" Her words trailed off as she swayed slightly, exhaustion threatening to claim her. Dominic found himself stepping closer, his hand reaching out instinctively before he caught himself. "What do you need?" She drew a shaky breath, those remarkable eyes reflecting the torchlight. "Can I sleep by your gate? Just until the storm passes. I won't be any trouble, I promise. I have nowhere else to go." The simple request hit him harder than any demand for riches or political favor ever could. This woman, this beautiful, fragile creature, was asking for nothing more than the chance to survive the night in the bitter cold outside his walls. "No," Dominic said firmly, and he watched the hope die in her expression, her shoulders sagging with defeat. But before she could turn away, he continued, his voice softer now, more vulnerable than he had allowed it to be in years. "You belong beside me inside." The words surprised him as much as they did her. He had intended to offer her proper guest quarters, perhaps a warm meal and safe passage in the morning. Instead, he had spoken from some deeper truth he wasn't ready to examine. Her eyes widened with disbelief, tears threatening to spill over. Your Majesty." "I couldn't possibly. You can and you will." Dominic stepped aside, gesturing toward the keep's entrance. "No one sleeps in the cold tonight." As she took her first hesitant step toward warmth and safety, Dominic felt the first crack form in the ice that had encased his heart for so many years. Chapter 4. The Forbidden Invitation. Dominic led the mysterious Omega through corridors that had never before welcomed such a guest. Her bare feet left small wet prints on the polished stone floors, and he noticed how she favored her left leg, clearly injured though she tried to hide it. The urge to simply carry her to safety overwhelmed him, but he maintained careful distance, even as his wolf howled for closer contact. Servants scattered from their path, their shocked faces reflecting the unprecedented nature of their king, bringing an unknown Omega into the keep's inner sanctum. Dominic ignored their stares, focusing instead on the way moonlight streaming through tall windows illuminated the woman beside him, making her appear almost ethereal. "What is your name?" he asked as they climbed the curved staircase toward the guest quarters. She hesitated, her fingers trailing along the carved banister. "Seraphina, Your Majesty." The name suited her perfectly. Angelic, otherworldly, beautiful. Dominic found himself repeating it silently, savoring how it felt in his mind. He guided her to the finest guest chamber, its hearth already crackling with warmth. Rich tapestries covered the stone walls, and a four-poster bed dominated the space, piled high with furs and silken coverlets. Serafina stood in the doorway, as if afraid to enter, wonder filling her features. "This is too much," she whispered. "I asked only for shelter by your gate. And I decided you deserved better." Dominic moved to light additional candles, needing the activity to distract himself from her intoxicating presence. "There are clean clothes in the wardrobe. Food will be brought shortly." She stepped carefully into the room, her movements graceful despite obvious exhaustion. "Why are you doing this? You don't know anything about me." The question stopped him short. Why was he doing this? Beyond the mate bond pulling at his consciousness, beyond the protective instincts she triggered, there was something else. Her dignity in the face of desperation reminded him of strength he had forgotten existed, the kind that came from enduring rather than conquering. "Perhaps that's exactly why," he said finally. "Too often, knowing someone means knowing their agenda." Serafina sank onto the edge of the bed, her careful composure finally cracking. "I have no agenda, Your Majesty, only gratitude." As he prepared to leave her to rest, she called softly, "Dominic?" The sound of his name on her lips sent warmth spreading through his chest. He turned back to find her watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Thank you," she said simply, "for seeing me as worth saving." Chapter 5. The Council's Growing Concern. Over the next several days, Dominic found himself drawn repeatedly to Serafina's chambers. What began as ensuring her comfort gradually became something deeper, conversations that challenged his perspectives and moments of connection that felt revolutionary after years of isolation. He discovered that despite her lack of formal education, Serafina possessed keen intelligence and hard-won wisdom. Their discussions ranged from philosophy to kingdom management, her insights often surprising him with their depth. "When you're property, you learn to observe everything," she explained during one afternoon conversation. "The way power moves, how decisions affect the powerless, what motivates those in control. Survival depends on reading people correctly." Her words reminded him of the vast gulf between their experiences. Yet somehow their different paths had led them to these moments of understanding that both challenged and enlightened him. The changes in Dominic didn't go unnoticed. Servants whispered about their king's softer demeanor, the way his rare smiles came more easily. Captain Marcus mentioned that His Majesty seemed more patient during training sessions, less likely to unleash his legendary temper. Even Dominic's wolf felt different, less caged, more complete. The restless energy that had plagued him for years had settled into something approaching peace. However, his council grew increasingly concerned about their king's attachment to the mysterious Omega. Lord Chancellor Mordecai began scheduling more frequent meetings, probing gently about Dominic's plans for political marriages. High Priestess Lyanna made pointed comments about the importance of maintaining proper royal protocol. After a week of watching their king's transformation, the council could no longer remain silent. "Your Majesty," Mordecai began during what appeared to be a routine briefing, "we must address the unprecedented situation that has developed." Dominic set down his quill with deliberate calm, though tension coiled in his shoulders. "I assume you refer to offering shelter to a traveler in need?" "We refer to the extended presence of an unknown individual within our stronghold," Lord Commander Garrett interjected, his scarred face troubled. "Without proper investigation or security protocols." The careful way they avoided using Serafina's name or acknowledging her obvious importance to him stirred something dangerous in Dominic's chest. "Are you questioning my judgment?" he asked quietly. "We're expressing concern about the wisdom of forming attachments to individuals whose backgrounds remain mysterious," Lyanna replied smoothly. "The kingdom's interests must remain paramount." As the conversation continued, Dominic realized his council's concerns ran deeper than simple protocol. They feared his growing feelings might compromise his duty, the same fear that had driven him to isolation for so many years. But for the first time, he found himself wondering if the real threat to his kingdom wasn't love itself, but the fear of it. Chapter 6. The Deepening Bond. Against all protocol, Dominic began personally bringing Serafina her meals, abandoning the careful distance he had maintained from everyone else in his life. These simple acts felt revolutionary, sitting across from her as she ate, watching her face light up when she tasted something particularly good, sharing stories that revealed pieces of themselves they had never shared with others. During one such evening, as candlelight flickered between them, Serafina spoke of her past with careful honesty. "I was bound to a master who saw omegas as objects rather than people," she said quietly, her hands steady despite the painful memories. Escape meant 3 days through winter storms, with nothing but hope that somewhere, someone might show mercy. "That took tremendous courage," Dominic observed. She shook her head. "It took desperation. Courage would have been staying and fighting." "Sometimes running is the bravest choice of all." Dominic leaned forward, drawn by impulses he couldn't name. "Especially when it leads you to where you belong." Their eyes met across the small space, and the mate bond hummed between them like a living thing. When her fingers accidentally brushed his, as she reached for bread, electricity sparked through his entire body. "Dominic," she whispered, and his name on her lips sounded like a prayer. These moments of connection began to accumulate, each one deepening the bond between them. Dominic found himself thinking of her during council meetings, listening for her footsteps in the corridors, treasuring the sound of her quiet laughter when she discovered something that delighted her. The careful walls he had built around his heart didn't crumble all at once. They eroded gradually, worn away by accumulated moments of trust and understanding. Chapter 7. The Discovery. 3 weeks after Serafina's arrival, Dominic was reviewing correspondence in his private study when she knocked softly on his door. She carried her worn backpack, her expression troubled in a way that immediately put him on alert. "There's something I need to show you," she said quietly. "Something I remembered." She opened the pack and withdrew a faded photograph, a modest brick apartment building with sunlight glinting across its windows. Dominic's blood chilled as recognition struck him. "I know that building," he said slowly. "I designed it 15 years ago. It was one of my first major projects." Serafina nodded, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "That's where we lived, my mother and I, before everything changed. It was the happiest time I remember." She told him about their small apartment, with its flower-filled balcony, about Sunday morning cookies and neighbors who became friends, about the gradual rent increases that eventually forced them out, beginning the downward spiral that led to her mother's death and her own enslavement. "I keep this photograph to remember what home felt like," she finished quietly, "what it meant to belong somewhere." The revelation hit Dominic like a physical blow. The little girl who had once called his building home now sat before him as the woman who owned his heart. The success he had celebrated 15 years ago had contributed to the chain of events that brought her such pain. "I didn't know," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I never thought about the human cost of those decisions." "You couldn't have known," Serafina replied gently. "But that's why your kindness to me means so much. You saw someone worth saving when I couldn't see it myself." In that moment, Dominic understood that their connection went deeper than mere attraction or even the mate bond. Fate had woven their stories together across years and circumstances, bringing them to this point where they could heal old wounds and build something better together. Chapter 8. The External Threat. The arrival of Lord Aldrich of House Ravencrest brought unwelcome complications to the fragile peace Dominic had found. The visiting Alpha commanded armies that could tip the balance in any conflict, making him too powerful to simply dismiss. He had specifically requested an audience to discuss strengthening alliances through marriage. Dominic received him in the Great Hall, maintaining the diplomatic formality such negotiations required, though his mind wandered to gentle laughter and remarkable eyes. "Your Majesty," Aldrich began after proper courtesies, "I come bearing a proposal that could significantly strengthen both our territories." "I listen," Dominic replied carefully. "My daughter Morgana is of age to wed, blessed with both beauty and intelligence. A union between our houses would create an unbreakable alliance across the northern territories." The words felt like ice water in Dominic's veins. Weeks ago, he might have considered such a proposal purely on its political merits. Now, the thought of binding himself to anyone other than Serafina seemed like betrayal of his very soul. An intriguing proposal, Dominic managed, diplomatic training taking over. However, such decisions require careful consideration. Of course, Aldrich agreed, though his eyes glittered with something calculating. Though I must say, Your Majesty, there are interesting scents in your keep. Has someone of significance taken residence recently? The probe felt like a test of Dominic's commitment to traditional political arrangements. His wolf stirred defensively, recognizing a potential threat to their mate. I host many guests, Dominic replied neutrally. The doors of Shadowmere have always been open to those in need. Indeed. Though I do hope any temporary attachments won't interfere with necessary political arrangements. The veiled threat made Dominic's hands clench beneath the table. How dare this man suggest that Serafina was merely a temporary attachment? Yet he couldn't reveal the true nature of his feelings without creating a diplomatic incident. I assure you, Lord Aldrich, Dominic said with deadly quiet, I always honor my commitments. The question is simply, which commitments deserve my honor? As the meeting concluded with polite but meaningless pleasantries, Dominic realized that his private happiness would soon collide with his public duties in ways that might force him to choose between his heart and his crown. Chapter 9. The Growing Pressure. Lord Aldrich extended his stay, pressing his suit for the marriage alliance with increasing insistence. Each day brought new conversations about political necessity, strategic advantages, and the importance of traditional bloodline alliances. The pressure from both Aldrich and Dominic's own council created a tension that permeated the entire castle. Meanwhile, Dominic's relationship with Serafina deepened through stolen moments, midnight meetings in the private library, quiet conversations in the castle's hidden garden, shared meals when protocol allowed. Each encounter strengthened the bond between them, making the thought of any other arrangement feel increasingly impossible. You're troubled, Serafina observed during one of their clandestine meetings in the moonlit garden. Is it because of Lord Aldrich's proposal? Her perceptiveness shouldn't have surprised him by now, yet it did. Servants hear everything, she continued with a sad smile. They know he wants you to marry his daughter. And what do they say about that? He asked carefully. They wonder why their king seems less present since the proposal arrived, why he walks the halls like a man trapped in a cage of his own making. She stepped closer, her hand finding his in the darkness. They wonder if their king's heart belongs elsewhere. The simple touch sent warmth racing through his entire body. In that moment, surrounded by winter roses and silver moonlight, Dominic made a decision that would have seemed impossible weeks ago. It does, he admitted quietly. My heart belongs entirely elsewhere. Her breath caught, hope and fear warring in her expression. Dominic, I love you, he said simply, the words carrying absolute truth. I love your strength, your compassion, your brilliant mind. I love the way you make me want to be better than I am. Tears gathered in her eyes, but her smile was radiant. And I love you. Despite every reason why I shouldn't, despite knowing it could destroy us both. Then we'll find a way, Dominic declared, pulling her into his arms. There has to be a path that doesn't require sacrificing love for duty. But even as he held her close, breathing in her intoxicating scent, Dominic knew that finding such a path would require navigating treacherous waters between personal desire and political necessity. The walls of his carefully controlled world were crumbling, and soon he would have to choose between the crown he had always worn and the love he had never expected to find. Chapter 10. The Ancient Discovery. During the 4th week of Serafina's residence at Shadowmere, an urgent summons arrived from Elder Matthias, the castle's scholar-keeper. The elderly man claimed to have discovered something of critical importance while researching historical precedents for royal marriages involving previously enslaved individuals. Dominic arrived at the library to find not only Matthias, but also his entire council, their faces grave with concern that immediately put him on alert. Your Majesty, Matthias began, his weathered hands trembling as he held an ancient scroll. In researching precedents for recent developments, I have uncovered a prophecy that demands immediate attention. Dominic's blood chilled at the scholar's tone. What sort of prophecy? Matthias unrolled the parchment, revealing text written in the old tongue alongside strange symbols. This dates to the time of the first Wolf Kings. It speaks of the blood moon and a destined union that brings both salvation and destruction. Read it, Lord Chancellor Mordecai commanded, his voice tight with barely contained alarm. The old scholar's voice grew hollow as he translated, "When silver hair catches crimson moonlight, when violet depths reflect the wolf's soul, the north shall know its greatest trial. The mate who warms the Wolf King's heart shall be the blade that severs his kingdom's throat. Through love shall come the ending of all things." Silence fell, like a physical weight. Dominic felt the world tilt beneath his feet as the implications crashed over him. Seraphina, silver hair, unusual eyes, arriving during the season of blood moons. The description was disturbingly precise. "There's more," Matthias continued reluctantly. "The prophecy speaks of a birthmark, a crescent moon upon the chosen one's shoulder, marking them as the herald of change." Dominic's heart nearly stopped. He had seen that mark 2 nights ago, when Seraphina's cloak had slipped during their garden walk. A perfect silver crescent on her left shoulder blade, which he had thought beautiful and mysterious. "This explains the unusual pull you feel toward her," High Priestess Lyanna declared, her voice sharp with vindication. "The timing of her arrival, the way she appeared exactly when the old texts predicted." "You don't know that these prophecies are accurate," Dominic protested, though doubt crept into his voice. "The prophecy also mentions her lineage," Matthias added softly. "She bears blood of House Drakemore, the lost pack that was exiled from these lands 3 generations ago, after a bitter conflict with your grandfather." Another piece fell into place with devastating clarity. Seraphina wasn't just the love he had never expected. She might be connected to his family's ancient enemies. "The council must consider all possibilities," Mordecai stated formally. "The kingdom's safety cannot be compromised by personal attachments, however, genuine they may appear." As his advisors looked at him expectantly, Dominic realized that loving Seraphina might have placed both of them in terrible danger, and now he would need to discover the truth behind these prophecies before fear and suspicion destroyed everything they had built together. Chapter 11. Seeking Truth. That night, Dominic found himself in the castle's deepest archives, surrounded by centuries of accumulated knowledge and desperate for answers that might save both Seraphina and his kingdom. He had dismissed his guards, needing solitude to think clearly about the impossible situation. Ancient texts lay scattered across reading tables as he searched for alternative interpretations, historical context, or any evidence that might explain the prophecies differently. The logistics troubled him. How could anyone have predicted Seraphina's specific appearance and timing with such accuracy? "You're looking for hope in dusty books," Seraphina's voice came from the archive entrance, gentle but knowing. Dominic looked up to find her standing in the doorway, still beautiful, despite the shadows of worry around her eyes. She had clearly heard about the council's discovery. Castle gossip traveled faster than royal decrees. "I'm looking for the truth," he replied, rising from his chair. "There has to be more to this prophecy than a simple condemnation." Seraphina stepped into the chamber, her movements careful despite the weight of revelation. "What if the truth is exactly what they fear? What if I really am connected to your family's enemies?" "Then we'll face that truth together," Dominic declared, pulling her into his arms. The feel of her against him, warm and real and perfect, strengthened his resolve rather than weakening it. "I remember fragments now," she whispered against his chest. "Dreams of a life before my enslavement, stories my mother told me about our family's history. I think I might actually be from House Drakemore." The admission should have terrified him. Instead, it only made him hold her tighter. "Then we'll discover what that really means." "How can you still want to protect me when I might be everything they claim?" Dominic pulled back to look into her eyes, seeing fear and love warring in their depths. Because I know who you choose to be, Seraphina, not what bloodline you carry or what prophecies claim, but who you are in your heart. You're kind, brave, intelligent, compassionate. Those qualities don't change because of ancient words on parchment. The Council will never accept that reasoning. Then the Council will need to see proof. Dominic's mind was already working through possibilities. I'm going to investigate these prophecies thoroughly, and when I discover the truth, I'll prove that love strengthens rather than weakens kingdoms. As they stood together in the archives, surrounded by the accumulated wisdom of ages, Dominic felt certainty settle in his bones. He would not lose Seraphina to ancient fears and political expedients. Whatever the prophecies truly meant, he would face them with her by his side. Chapter 12. The investigation deepens. Dominic's research through the following days yielded disturbing discoveries about the prophecy's origins. Hidden in diplomatic correspondences from his grandfather's era, he found letters that painted a complex picture of the conflict with House Drakemore. The exile hadn't been about betrayal or violence, as he had always been told. Instead, it concerned a fundamental disagreement about how the northern territories should be governed. House Drakemore had advocated for more inclusive policies, better treatment of Omegas, and cooperation between packs rather than strict hierarchical control. Several concerning prophecies have surfaced recently, his grandfather had written to a trusted advisor, all designed to create fear about changes that might actually benefit our people. I suspect some of my own council members prefer maintaining the old ways, regardless of their effectiveness. The advisor's response was even more revealing. The Drakemore exile was a mistake driven by fear of change. Their proposals for social reform weren't treasonous, they were progressive. Perhaps the current prophecies serve similar purposes. Armed with this evidence, Dominic summoned Captain Marcus for a discreet investigation. The captain's loyalty had never wavered, and his skills would be essential for uncovering the truth. I need you to trace the connections between these old letters and our current council, Dominic explained, showing Marcus the correspondence. If I'm right, some prophecies might be fabricated to maintain political control rather than provide genuine divine guidance. Marcus studied the documents with growing understanding. Fear-based manipulation disguised as religious prophecy, it would explain why the timing seems so convenient. Exactly. But we need proof before I can act. The council won't accept accusations without evidence. As Marcus departed on his investigation, Dominic felt renewed hope burning in his chest. If he could prove the prophecies were politically motivated rather than divinely inspired, he could protect Seraphina and expose the true threats to his kingdom's future. But time was working against them. Each day brought increased pressure from both his council and Lord Aldrich for decisions about marriage alliances and the Drakemore threat. Chapter 13. The Ultimatum. The emergency council session convened on the 5th week after Seraphina's arrival, its atmosphere charged with the tension that preceded major political decisions. Dominic sat at the head of the ancient table, his hands carefully controlled to hide their tension as his advisors presented their demands with formal precision. The prophecy cannot be ignored indefinitely, Lord Commander Garrett declared, his scarred face set in grim lines. Every detail matches, her appearance, her heritage, the timing of her arrival. We must consider that she represents a genuine threat. The birthmark confirms the prophecy's accuracy, High Priestess Lyanna added, her pale eyes cold with certainty. The crescent moon marking her as the herald of significant change. This cannot be mere coincidence. Dominic fought to maintain his composed facade while his world balanced on a knife's edge. Prophecies are often metaphorical. Perhaps the change it speaks of isn't destructive. Are you willing to stake the lives of everyone in this kingdom on interpretation? Mordecai challenged, leaning forward across the polished wood. Your duty is clear, Dominic. You swore an oath to protect this realm above all else. And what exactly are you proposing? Dominic's voice carried dangerous undertones that made several council members shift uncomfortably. The threat must be neutralized, Garrett stated bluntly, through exile at minimum, permanently if necessary. The implications hung in the air like a death sentence. Dominic's wolf snarled within him, ready to tear apart anyone who dared threaten their mate. The primitive urge to protect Serafina warred with his rational understanding that his advisors genuinely believed they were protecting the kingdom. "She's committed no crime," Dominic protested, though the words felt inadequate against their fear. "Her existence fulfills the prophecy," Lyanna replied coldly. "According to ancient law, that constitutes a threat in itself." Mordecai placed a formal document on the table, an exile order requiring only the king's signature. "This is about prevention, Your Majesty. The kingdom must come before personal feelings." Dominic stared at the parchment that would tear Serafina from his life forever. Everything he had learned about justice and evidence warred with the political necessity his council represented. "I need time to consider this," Dominic said finally. "Time is a luxury we cannot afford," Garrett insisted. "Every day increases the risk that the prophecy will unfold as predicted." "You have until tomorrow's sunset," Mordecai declared, his tone brooking no argument. "After that, the council will act according to our oath to protect this kingdom." As his advisors filed out, leaving him alone with the exile order, Dominic realized that tomorrow's sunset might mark not just Serafina's banishment, but the death of everything good he had discovered about himself. The choice between duty and love had never felt more impossible or more heartbreaking. Chapter 14. The Conspiracy Revealed. That same night, Captain Marcus returned with evidence that would change everything. His investigation had uncovered a web of correspondence between certain council members and outside political interests, all working to maintain traditional power structures through manufactured crises. "Your Majesty," Marcus began, his face grim with discovery, "the prophecies aren't ancient divine warnings. They're recent fabrications designed to prevent exactly the kind of progressive alliance you found with Lady Serafina." He spread documents across Dominic's desk, letters, payment records, and coded messages that painted a clear picture of conspiracy. "Lord Aldrich has been working with High Priestess Lyanna and others to create prophetic justifications for their political goals. They want to prevent any marriages that might lead to social reforms, particularly those that would improve conditions for Omegas and lower-ranking pack members." Dominic studied the evidence with growing fury and relief. They manufactured the Drakemore threat? The original House Drakemore conflict was real, but it was about progressive policies, not betrayal. They were exiled for advocating reforms that would have weakened traditional power structures. Marcus pointed to specific documents. "These current prophecies were created to ensure no Drakemore descendant could ever return to influence northern politics." And Serafina's birthmark? Likely tattooed during her enslavement to mark her as a Drakemore descendant, should she ever be discovered. They've been planning this manipulation for years. The scope of the deception was staggering. Dominic's council hadn't just been misled. Some of them were active participants in a conspiracy to control his marriage and kingdom policies through fabricated religious prophecies. "We have enough evidence to expose the conspiracy," Marcus concluded, "but Lord Aldrich's soldiers still occupy strategic positions in the castle. Moving against them will require careful planning." As dawn approached with its deadline for decision, Dominic realized that the real battle wasn't between love and duty. It was between truth and manufactured fear, between progress and stagnation, between the kingdom he could build with Serafina and the one his enemies wanted to preserve through deception. Chapter 15. The Confrontation. The next morning, Dominic called an emergency assembly in the Great Hall, summoning not just his council, but also the castle's knights, visiting nobles and senior servants. If he was going to expose the conspiracy, he wanted witnesses who could spread the truth throughout the northern territories. Lord Aldrich and his supporters arrived expecting to witness Serafina's exile or worse. Instead, they found themselves facing a king who had armed himself with evidence and righteous fury. "Lords and ladies of the realm," Dominic began, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall, "we gather today to address threats to our kingdom. But these threats come not from ancient prophecies or returning bloodlines. They come from those who would manipulate our fears for their own political gain. He gestured to Captain Marcus, who began distributing copies of the correspondence they had uncovered. Murmurs rippled through the crowd as people read evidence of the conspiracy. The prophecies that have caused such concern were fabricated by individuals seeking to control royal marriage decisions and prevent social reforms that would benefit all our people. Dominic's gaze fixed on Lord Aldrich, whose face had gone pale with growing alarm. "These are lies," High Priestess Lyanna protested, but her voice lacked conviction as more evidence was revealed. "The letters are in your own hand," Dominic replied calmly, discussing payment for prophetic services and strategies for maintaining traditional hierarchies through religious manipulation. Serafina entered the hall at that moment, escorted by loyal guards and wearing a simple but elegant gown that emphasized her dignity rather than her vulnerability. She walked with quiet confidence to stand beside Dominic, no longer hiding, but claiming her place with courage. "Lady Serafina of House Drakemore," Dominic announced formally, "whose ancestors were exiled not for betrayal, but for advocating policies that would have strengthened our kingdom through inclusion and reform." The assembled crowd studied her with new understanding, seeing not a prophesied destroyer, but a woman whose heritage represented positive change rather than threat. "The real prophecy," Dominic continued, "is that love and unity make kingdoms stronger than fear and division ever could. Today, we choose which future we want to build." As evidence of the conspiracy spread through the hall, and Lord Aldrich's supporters found themselves isolated and exposed, Dominic felt the tide of political fortune shift decisively in favor of truth over manipulation. Chapter 16. The New Dawn. With the conspiracy exposed and its architects either fleeing or surrendering, Dominic wasted no time in implementing the changes that his kingdom truly needed. The false prophecies had actually revealed the path forward, not through fear of change, but through embracing it. His first act was to officially pardon House Drakemore and restore their honor, acknowledging that their exile had been based on political manipulation rather than genuine wrongdoing. This opened the door for other progressive reforms that had been blocked by traditionalist fears. "The strength of a kingdom lies not in maintaining old divisions," Dominic announced to his newly reformed council, "but in building unity that honors both tradition and progress." Elder Matthias, promoted to chief advisor after proving his dedication to truth over convenience, helped draft new laws that protected Omegas from exploitation while maintaining pack hierarchies based on merit rather than birth circumstances. Serafina's insights proved invaluable in crafting policies that addressed real problems rather than maintaining comfortable fictions. Her experiences had given her understanding of the kingdom's vulnerabilities that no amount of formal education could provide. "Every person in this realm has value," she said during her first formal address as Dominic's acknowledged mate and advisor. "Not because of what they were born as, but because of what they choose to contribute." The changes weren't merely symbolic. Trade routes opened with territories that had been considered hostile. Marriage laws were reformed to honor genuine partnerships over political arrangements. The rigid social hierarchies that had kept talented individuals from contributing began to soften. Lord Aldrich, stripped of his false authority and facing exile himself, made a final, desperate attempt to gather support for resistance. But the evidence of his deception had spread too widely, and former allies abandoned him rather than face association with proven manipulators. "We've learned that fear weakens kingdoms," Dominic told the assembled nobles who had come to witness the transformation. "But love, genuine love based on choice and respect, creates strength that no enemy can break." The prophesied destruction had indeed come to pass, but it was the destruction of old limitations, not the kingdom itself. Chapter 17. The True Union. The wedding ceremony took place on the anniversary of the night Serafina had first asked to sleep by Dominic's gate. The great hall had been transformed with flowers and light, but the most significant change was in the faces of those gathered, no longer marked by fear and suspicion, but bright with genuine hope for the future. Dominic stood at the altar wearing ceremonial armor that represented strength guided by wisdom, while Serafina approached in a gown of midnight blue embroidered with silver stars, a design that honored both their houses' histories while pointing toward their shared future. Elder Matthias performed the ceremony, his voice carrying the weight of tradition adapted for new understanding. Today, we witness not just the union of two hearts, but the fulfillment of true destiny. Through love, what was broken becomes whole. Through unity, what was weak becomes strong. As they spoke their vows, Dominic felt the mate bond settling into something deeper than attraction or even romantic love. It was partnership in its truest form, two people choosing to build something together that neither could create alone. "I choose you not because prophecy demands it," Dominic declared, his voice reaching every corner of the hall, "but because you make me better than I ever thought possible. You teach me that true strength comes from lifting others up rather than standing alone." Seraphina's vows brought tears to many eyes. "I choose you not because you rescued me from the cold, but because you saw worth in me when I couldn't see it myself. You showed me that love isn't weakness, it's the greatest courage of all." When Elder Matthias pronounced them king and queen, united in both law and love, the celebration that erupted seemed to shake the foundations of the castle. But it was joyful transformation, the kind that came from structures evolving rather than crumbling. The feast that followed lasted until dawn, with nobles and servants celebrating together in ways that would have been unthinkable months before. Music and laughter filled corridors that had echoed with cold silence for too long. As the celebration continued around them, Dominic and Seraphina slipped away to the battlements where their story had begun. Looking out over their kingdom, they could see lights in every window, evidence of a people no longer afraid to hope. "Any regrets?" Seraphina asked, her hand finding his in the familiar gesture that had become their anchor. "Only that it took me so long to understand that the greatest strength comes from choosing love over fear," Dominic replied, pulling her close as stars appeared in the darkening sky. Chapter 18. The legacy unfolds, 5 years later. The changes that had begun with a whispered request at a castle gate had transformed not just Shadowmere, but influenced kingdoms throughout the northern territories. The annual Festival of Unity, celebrating the day the false prophecies were exposed, drew visitors from distant lands, all eager to learn how cooperation had created prosperity. King Dominic and Queen Seraphina walked through the festival grounds hand in hand, watching children play games that emphasized teamwork over dominance, observing merchants from various territories trading freely without the suspicion that had once governed such interactions. Their own children, twin cubs with their father's steel-gray eyes and their mother's quick intelligence, chased fireflies through the garden where their parents had first confessed their love. Princess Luna and Prince Marcus embodied the new world their parents had built, confident without arrogance, strong without cruelty, leaders who understood that true power came from serving rather than ruling. "Sometimes I dream about that night," Seraphina mused as they paused by the fountain where moonlight turned water into liquid silver. "About what would have happened if you had said yes to my original request." Dominic smiled, understanding the game they sometimes played with alternate histories. "Then you would have slept cold and alone outside my walls, and I would have remained the same bitter, isolated king I was before." "Exactly." She turned in his arms, her eyes sparkling with the warmth that had never dimmed despite all the responsibilities of queenship. Sometimes the best answer to what we think we want is no, because it forces us to discover what we actually need. Around them, the festival continued with joy that felt as natural as breathing. Former enemies shared meals and stories. Children from different social backgrounds played together without concern for anything but friendship. Couples who had found love across traditional boundaries celebrated openly, their unions seen as strength rather than scandal. "The false prophecies spoke one truth," Dominic observed, watching young wolves from different packs work together to decorate the central pavilion. "Love did transform our world, just not through destruction, but through creation of something better." As the moon rose over their thriving kingdom, casting silver light on a realm built on love rather than fear, Dominic and Seraphina knew their story had become more than personal triumph. It had become proof that sometimes the greatest courage lay not in maintaining what was, but in embracing what could be. The little Omega who had once asked to sleep by a king's gate had indeed found her place beside him, not just in his castle or his bed, but in building a legacy that would endure long after their own stars had faded from the sky. Love had conquered fear, unity had overcome division, and hope had triumphed over despair. The Wolf King had found his salvation, and in saving himself, he had saved them all. Epilogue. The enduring truth years passed, and the story of King Dominic and Queen Seraphina became legend throughout the northern realms. Children learned from their tale that true strength came not from walls built to keep others out, but from bridges built to bring them in, and that the greatest bridge of all was love, love that saw worth where others saw worthlessness, hope where others saw despair, and possibility where others saw only endings. The prophecy had been fulfilled after all, though not in the way anyone expected. Through love, the old world had indeed ended, and through that same love, a better one had begun. In the castle archives, scholars preserved not just the false prophecies that had nearly destroyed everything, but also the correspondence that exposed them, ensuring that future generations would understand the difference between truth and manipulation, between genuine divine guidance and manufactured fear. And in the royal chambers, a simple photograph still held a place of honor. Not the image of grand palaces or military victories, but of a modest brick building where a mother and daughter had once known happiness before the world took it away. It served as a reminder that every person's story mattered, every loss deserved acknowledgement, and every ending could become a new beginning when approached with love instead of fear. The crown had found its heart, and in doing so, had discovered that the greatest kingdom of all was the one built in the space between two people who chose to see the best in each other, no matter what prophecies, true or false, might say about their destiny.